hermosa, de la flor la rosa, tú preciosa eres la semilla. Tus ojos son la octava maravilla que en este mundo se ha logrado. Tu cuerpo perfecto como Da Vinci ha pintado. La Mona Lisa y es tu risa que ha marcado el sufrimiento de este tonto pobre hombre enamorado. Ya que has llegado, entra, pasa, estás en tu casa. Tú y yo juntos solo para amarnos, nena, pasa.
Tienes una forma seductora de moverte frente a mí. Nena, me haces vibrar. Dama, arañas como una gata. Dama, eres hija de una diabla. Tienes una forma seductora de moverte frente a mí. Nena, me haces vibrar. Dama, arañas como una gata. Dama, eres hija de una diabla. Se te ve pasar con tu genio. Se te ve pasar con tu caminar. Se te ve pasar con tu genio. Se te ve pasar. Tienes una forma seductora de moverte frente a mí. Nena, me haces vibrar. Tu cuerpo rima con tu cara y me seduce tu mirada. Y ese calor que te envuelve me llega y me toca. Ahí me quema. Tirum, dum, 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 dereira. Tienes una forma seductora de moverte frente a mí. Nena, me haces vibrar a mí. Dama, arañas como una gata. Dama, eres hija de una diabla. Tienes una forma seductora de moverte frente a mí. Nena, me haces vibrar a mí. Dama, arañas como una gata. Dama, eres hija de una diabla. Tienes una forma seductora de moverte frente a mí. Nena, me haces vibrar a mí. Dama, arañas como una gata. Dama, eres hija de una diabla. Se te ve pasar con tu genio. Se te ve pasar con tu caminar. Se te ve pasar con tu genio. Se te ve pasar con tu caminar. Se te ve pasar con tu genio. Se te ve pasar. Se te ve pasar con tu caminar.
Right, ladies and gentlemen, I see we're more than 3 minutes late. When I first went to work at the European Patent Office, I was introduced to the interesting concept of Dutch timekeeping, which is not at all my idea of timekeeping, cultural difference. But I would like us to press on. We have a number of speakers, each of whom will speak for 5 minutes, and then we'll hear a gong. And that is the end of that. Our first speaker is Ian Cotgreve, who will talk about the importance of the C factor when responding to future challenges. Ian.
I'm actually representing an organization, a secret organization called the Men in Black. Okay. So my experience is drawn from the SURAT program and EU Toxris program, alternatives to animals in risk assessment, also 10 years of experience of working in AstraZeneca, building in silico in vitro tools to predict human hazard and build it into chemistry. So as we move through the paradigm shift from the left to right here, from pathology to pathway, we've heard a lot about that before. We're focusing on in vitro and in silico technologies and more emphasis on this in risk assessment. That's given rise to paradigms which Bob van der Water discussed yesterday, the EU Toxris program, how that's working. But what's happening is it's generating truckloads of data from different sources, apples and pears and bananas. You've got high content biology, next-gen sequencing data. You've got all this being mashed about by peculiar statistical technologies, Dempster-Shafer and so on and so forth for uncertainties. We've got a lot of modeling going on in there, QIVIE modeling. We've got a lot of PKPD modeling going on, and all of this is being organized into information knowledge bases according to the adverse outcome pathways. This is putting a lot of pressure on having the right people at the right time, and it's changing the competence sets that are feeding into risk assessment as we go along. Therefore, we have to think about new ways of recruiting our future scientists to work in toxicological sciences and risk assessment. And I coined a bunch of C's, and we've heard a lot of them already, so it's wonderful. I've heard a lot of these C's here, but I won't go through them. Collaborative, combinatorial, communicative, all these C's are relevant. Even when you're making interviews, you could do a checkbox at EFSA. Have you got these qualities? If not, you're not getting into the building. But the last one I want to discuss, which is the computational world, which everybody goes, hey, you, it's full of geeks. I don't want to know anything about that. But sorry, computational technology today, individually, the skill sets are highly defined. They're very difficult people to recruit. They all have different penchants, from data processing to machine learning, as we heard, and so on and so forth, all the way over to qualitative and quantitative risk assessment by weighing evidence. Each of these processes are run by computer geeks. All right? These are my friends. Working in the farm industry, we had big units of these guys, okay? So I want to lay on a surface above that, and we've already heard that so eloquently put from the introduction, on artificial intelligence, the AI. It's not actually alien intelligence, although I'm from Men in Black. It's artificial intelligence. And on the left-hand side, you see why we're worried by it. On the right-hand side, you see why it actually is going to help us out. Because my wife is always telling me I'm not remembering her wedding anniversary. So the computational technologies today are really, really there to do this. And so if we call the future risk assessment paradigm Sherlock Holmes, let's call it Sherlock Holmes, it's actually, we're going to have to recruit people by the name of Watson in the surname. Now Watson, the high-level computational technology in Watson, today is already doing extremely serious business within clinical diagnosis, pathological diagnosis, personalized healthcare, personalized therapeutic choices. That's serious business. And so the AI inside Watson is helping companies. There are other solutions to this. I've just chosen Watson to be flippant, but to be illustrative. And so I rest my case. If we are not dealing with this at the technical level, at the regulatory level, within the next 10 to 20 years, we have missed the boat. We need to know how to recruit people, what kind of people, how to recruit them, how to retain them, and how to push them into the system that we've created for risk assessment. It will not be a standalone thing, but they need to be educated so that they can set the boundaries, performance of what the assessment tools should do and how the information should be gathered, assessed, assimilated, and then as it learns, as it grows, it will provide us with fantastic possibilities. Watson doesn't forget. That's the important thing. And Watson is able to acquire data at massive speed. And if you give it the right opportunities to worm its way into the right databases, as we heard already from the crowdsourcing and the machine learning going on in the Cochrane initiative, I'm sure that this will help us out in our risk assessment burden in the future. So that's the end of my pitch.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Next up, Alistair Witherspoon, embrace the change, improve efficiency through collaboration.
Thanks, Alison. So that was the title, but actually I came up with another title, which is Collaboration, the Agony and the Ecstasy. I'm going to talk about research collaboration, but a lot of what I say might actually apply to all sorts of other forms of working together. I think a lot of this is probably understood about food safety research. The issues are big, they're complex. The system within which they work is very complex. We need better approaches, probably multi and interdisciplinary, and particularly if they're going to lead to actually being able to do something. So increasingly, you're involving the social sciences more. That can be quite challenging for natural and biological scientists, as I've found out, but they do ask interesting questions. We all know resources are being stretched. Everybody's purse is being cut. People are getting dragged in all sorts of different directions. And actually, maybe what you're trying to do is not necessarily do it yourself, but you want to influence others to do it. And how do you get your voice heard in others' planning? And then the funding landscape is, well, all the words there and more. Fragmented, complex, opaque, rules-driven, conservative, my way or no way. Therein lies a lot of the agony. Maybe some benefits of if we can get some of this much more structured interaction. These aren't a given. I mean, you have to work at these, but here's some things that you maybe can hope will happen. Much better use of the available expertise pool and the funding resources. I mean, I think now there's probably a whole host of duplication that's going on, lots of overlap, but also, are we asking the right questions? Particularly when we're thinking about multidisciplinary approaches, we can probably ask better questions by involving different people. And that may not just be the scientists that you need to involve. Perhaps we can get less fragmentation. Is it better to have fewer, larger pieces of the jigsaw that actually might come together and mean something, rather than maybe get the outline of the picture, but actually you don't really know what's going on in the middle, and the things don't join up. If we can align research activities, then you might get those much clearer pathways to impact. And that joining up doesn't always mean coming together and integrating everything, so that you're doing sort of, it's like one organism, but maybe you have a very planned approach where you have a distribution of tasks and everybody is doing a particular thing that you know is going to come together later. And then hopefully probably build a bit more capacity and capability, so thinking about investing for the future. So with that in mind, earlier this year, I helped EFSA organize the Risk Assessment Research Assembly. This was the first time they sort of tried this sort of thing. And while it was really the start of a dialogue. This wasn't going to answer all the questions, but it was about building the support for public funding of research and food safety. There was a real concern, particularly in the food safety research community, that food safety, it was done and dusted. There's nothing more that needs to happen. Problem solved, go away. And they didn't see food safety coming up in a lot of the modern research planning, which was much more about sustainability, climate change, food security. Also maybe a bit more coordination of agenda setting, and also providing a platform for networking and facilitating new partnerships. You can find the report there. It's a darn good read, at least the bits that I wrote, and there's a lot of stuff in there. There was a lot of things that came out of that particular event. I mean, it wasn't quite as large as this. It was maybe 200 people from about 39 countries, but it was a very significant piece of work, pulling together all the different threads. But I think we're sort of in the C section of this part of the event. Hopefully it won't be as painful as a C section. But I picked out a few there. The 4 C's. I mean, the 4 C's in food safety terms is usually about chilling, cleaning, cross-contamination. Here we're talking about research planning or working together. Cooperation, and at all levels. And probably I think maybe that certainly needs much more regular exchange of information, much more opportunity to do that. You've got to identify areas to work together early enough to actually make it happen. Coordination, and that's either setting up joint activities from the outset or actually coming together and planning it out, as I've said. I think probably what that needs in the organizations who are involved is a really strong coordinator role. And that person, I think, needs the freedom and support from their organization to try new things. And maybe to be allowed to experiment a bit. I mean, we heard from Robert Madlin this morning about allowing experimenting and maybe, accepting that failure is an option, but learning from that and doing some new innovation. Now, could we actually get shared commissioning procedures amongst all these organizations? Maybe. Or even a common pot of funds. Wow, wouldn't that be great? Collaboration, not just between funders, but also between funders and researchers, thinking more about co-designing and co-delivery of what needs to happen, hopefully minimize duplication. I think researchers could actually have a catalyst role in bringing the funders together. Maybe I'm, just pie in the sky. All of it underpinned by communication and trust. And that communication, I think, also the people who are involved need to think about, oh no.
Oh yes.
Was that really 5 minutes? Oh well. You'll get the rest of it later.
Thank you very much.
You can think what that means.
Thank you, Alistair. Next up, Tatiana Tachibana, the added value of the community and international collaboration, C word, in embracing scientific change, another C word.
Good afternoon. I'm Tachibana from Japan, and I'm here to talk about the international collaboration and its added value in embracing scientific change. I'm going to share with you my story in the Food Safety Commission of Japan, in which international collaboration has helped us to make a step in the right direction to introduce in silico approaches. FSCJ is a risk assessor in Japan, and it has 15 years history, so we have developed quite a stable operational system, but changing environment is posing us new challenges. On the demand side, we have increasing volume of incoming requests, mainly due to policy transition, such as positive list system in food contact materials or pesticides re-evaluation. Secondly, we are facing with the complexity, increasing complexity, because of the advancement of the data science. We have much more new technologies and methodologies, such as read-across, Cotter, benchmark dose modeling, that we need to check if it's fit for purpose for our own risk assessment and apply it to our daily practice. And third, we have increasing societal expectation for openness and transparency. But on the supply side, however, we cannot expand our scientific expertise as quickly as we wish to catch up with this growing demand. We need to find a path to increase both efficiency and the quality of our work. In this context, a few years ago, we decided to launch our discussion on emerging methodologies. We created an expert working group and started discussion on Cotter and read-across. To gather practical information, we reached out to international regulatory agencies to learn from them, learn from their experiences. They kindly shared with us their hands-on practices as well as the ideas behind their strategic decisions, such as database development and what they aim to harvest from such investment. So thanks to their open and helpful inputs, we could understand what's beyond the guidance documents or report. We could understand the reality as well as the forward-looking ideas. In these experiences, I found 3 added values in international collaboration. First, efficiency gain. We can avoid overlapping work and build on what's been already achieved. For example, in database development, we could use compatible formats. We could work together to develop common standards of quality or data inclusion criteria, bearing in mind possible future data sharing. Second, expertise gain. It enables us to go beyond the pool of experts in Japan and to reach out global expertise. It could also provide learning opportunity to experts in my country. And third, momentum gain. Wide international buy-in can be considered as a proof of high reliability on the new methodologies. It could give you more persuasive power to create a momentum for a change and to mobilize domestic stakeholders to let go of the comfort zone and to accept new paradigms. In my personal view, the key agenda for our future risk assessment is improving human risk assessment. International collaboration, as well as inter-agency or interdisciplinary collaboration would help us to find innovative ideas as well as efficient solutions to our new challenges. Finally, I would like to end my presentation by thanking all the international experts who I worked with for their passion and dedication and their extremely helpful attitudes and willingness to work together towards the same goal, improving public health. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed. Next up, Jean Lim, networking as a tool to scan the horizon and increase preparedness for regulatory agencies.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Alison, for the introduction. We would like to present to you, and that is on behalf of all the people and the representatives of the organizations, in a new group, a liaison group, international, which is in fact created to work together on methods for risk assessment of chemicals in food. And this is in fact, the reason is that many of the organizations, as you have also seen from Ruko, but also from Alistair, there was, let's say, a commitment to work together to see how, let's say, the different methodologies are interpreted and applied in practice, in the risk assessment practice. And many of the organizations worldwide, they have the same challenge to see if the risk assessment methodologies are applied in the proper way, and also if there are particular innovations that we can take on board. And as you have seen during this conference, there are lots of, let's say, methodologies being prepared and in development, which could be, let's say, useful for implementation in the risk assessment practice. So we grouped together, we have now 25 organizations, governmental organizations who are having a food safety risk assessment mandate, and also intergovernmental organizations, which have a very important role and responsibility to play in risk assessment. And what we are doing together is trying to follow the developments, the implementation, and also the innovation in the methodologies that we use for risk assessment of chemicals in food. We would like to identify if there are particular gaps for which we need further guidance and methodologies to develop. And also what we would like to do is to help and advise international organizations like WHO, FAO, and the OECD to identify if there are particular priorities in, let's say, the guidance for risk assessment of chemicals in food. And what we do is probably then also in eventually leading to a better understanding, a better interpretation of the methodologies that we apply worldwide, and that we also have the possibility to help avoiding duplication of efforts, that we can join activities if particular organizations are active in a particular methodology, and also that we, let's say, hope that we also identify less, let's say, problems in, let's say, differences between the way that these methodologies are applied in practice. And we have now started this year to have a couple of these conference calls where people are, let's say, joining and trying to start working on the work of this liaison group. And we had a very important meeting beginning of this week. And this week was in fact the start of having the people coming together to talk about what are we going to do in the next coming years. In 2020, we hope to evaluate if the platform is indeed giving added value, and we hope then to come with the recommendations that we intend to do for international harmonization of risk assessment methodologies for chemicals in food. Thank you so much.
Congratulations. And the final elevator pitch, John Palmer, using citizen science platforms and how to develop new capabilities to validate a broader set of information.
Thank you. Yes, so I want to continue the discussion of citizen science that Anna started before the break. I got into citizen science largely out of necessity because I'm interested in disease vector mosquitoes and their interactions with humans. And one of the problems with studying disease vector mosquitoes is that you need a lot of very local, fine-grained information, but you need it spread across large geographic areas. And I think that that's a problem that's common to many, many risk assessment and risk management issues that you also deal with at EFSA. And what we were finding was that traditional methods simply weren't covering the areas that we needed. Traditional methods involve ovitraps, entomologists. And when I sat down with colleagues in Spain and started talking about this, it occurred to us that while we're paying entomologists to chase mosquitoes, mosquitoes are going around chasing all of us. And so it would make a lot of sense if we could come up with a system for everybody who's encountering a mosquito to simply report it and to do it in a systematic way so that that data would be valuable. And that's what turned into a project that we call Mosquito Alert. And basically it provides a simple way for people to learn to identify key disease vector mosquitoes, in this case tiger mosquitoes and yellow fever mosquitoes, to report them with the information that we need to make those reports useful. What we found is in the past 4 years, we managed to attract 55,000 participants. We have 15,000 reports from them. And those reports let us make predictions about the distribution of mosquitoes across Spain that are really comparable in quality to what we get from the traditional methods, except that they cover the whole area. And so in this plot, in this map, what I'm showing you here is on the top left, the distribution of ovitraps, which is our traditional sensors for tiger mosquitoes, and on the top right, the Spanish distribution of citizen scientists participating in Mosquito Alert, and then on the bottom, the distribution of those citizen scientists worldwide participating in Mosquito Alert. So this was really, really exciting. And not only that, these citizen scientists are detecting mosquitoes for the first time in municipalities that we didn't know they existed in. And over the summer, in fact, they detected a new species of disease vector mosquito in Spain for the first time. What do you need to make this work? And how is this relevant to the work that EFSA does and other regulatory agencies deal with? And I think there's 3 key things. The first is dealing with data quality and potential sources of bias. And that's always one of the main concerns that people have, particularly in the context of public health and risk assessment. How do we know that this data is really helping us? And so we built into the system a way for the photographs that the citizen scientists send to be checked and validated by a small team of entomologists. So we have that check on it. We also use a crowdsourcing approach to photograph validation, very much like what Anna talked about. And we've been thinking through potential machine learning approaches as well. In fact, other citizen science projects do that very well, including Anna's on the sort of biodiversity side, and including mosquitoes, there's iNaturalist, which has a very good image recognition system. The other side of that, though, is the potential biases of not really knowing where these participants are located, and so not knowing if a particular town with no mosquito reports has no mosquitoes or just has no citizen scientists. And so we deal with that through a system of background tracking so that we track where the citizen scientists are, and we also learn about how they interact with the app in order to model the sampling effort distribution across territory. The second important factor in making this work is privacy. You need to protect privacy just from basic ethical principles. You need to protect privacy in order to make sure that people are willing to participate and trust you. And so, for example, we don't collect personally identifying information. We don't ask for people to create accounts. In fact, we don't let them create profiles. With the background tracks, we don't collect the exact location where they are. We collect a sampling cell ID at a relatively coarse scale, and that's good enough for our modeling needs. The third big important factor is collaboration among citizen science projects, and in fact we're involved in that at the global scale with other mosquito-based citizen science projects in a consortium called Global Mosquito Alert, but really also collaboration with the relevant agencies. And in our case, that's mostly the mosquito control services and the public health agencies. And that requires two-way information flow. That requires us developing useful tools for them to get the information that they need. But it also requires, and this is an example of one of the portals that we've created for municipal level public health agencies in Spain to visualize the data that they're going to use to make management decisions on a daily basis. And they do that. The Barcelona Public Health Agency uses our data to decide which water to treat.
Thank you very much. I think the gong is a wonderful invention. Right, thank you very much, panelists. Would you, all of you, now move up onto the stage? Thank you very much. Back you go. I think the... Right, Now we're moving to the second interactive period of the session. I have to tell you now that those are the most uncomfortable chairs in the world, and I hope they have not won a design award. That's an intellectual property comment, but just give thanks that you're sitting on those and not up there. Really bad news. Let me also put you on notice that before the end of this session, in sort of an hour or so, I shall be asking you to revisit your answer to the cloud question, to see what has moved in the course of our work today. The question was, what is the first word which comes to you when you think about expertise of the future? So I shall be nudging you, so use your little subconscious spare processing capacity to think about what your answer will be when I prompt you later. I will be coming back to that. Some of you have been submitting questions on the app, which thank you. And because I certainly attach importance to hearing from you, I wanted to start by going to a question on the app and going to the question that had most votes. This is slightly embarrassing because if I have read that little prompt in front of me, the first question actually is one from Kieran. Has had most votes. Could we have that up on the screen, please? I see a huddle at the back. That's the question for the Cloud app. I want the question that Kieran has put, which has the most votes. You could actually read it to us, Kieran. Yes, it's your question.
Is there a tension between credibility and influence? For example, a scientific view can be challenged extensively and therefore be seen as having less credibility. But the mere fact that it is being challenged so much suggests that it might be having a lot of influence.
Very interesting question. Can I ask the panelists to pick up on that? Can you see it adequately on the screen? Anybody want to go first?
It's really interesting.
Up your street. Off you go.
I think that's really, so answering that question, I think it's a fascinating issue because it's linked to the more fundamental question of legitimacy, which is in challenging the legitimacy of an idea, you're giving that idea credence. Yeah, absolutely.
So the answer is yes.
The answer is yes, yes, you do. In some sense.
Which, oh, distinguished members of this audience, means that you will need to reflect on how we can respond to that in terms of making change effective rather than making it counterproductive. I think a very interesting point. Anybody else on the panel want to pick up? Yes, Ian.
I have some experience from the pharmaceutical industry at a time when we were being challenged in Brussels on the use of animals in experimentation, and that led to a lot of changes. And being asked some extremely directed questions by MEPs in quorum in front of commissioners about that question. Clearly, it was an important question for everybody. Clearly, the science that we were doing to predict a human is fallible. Using animals is not the answer. We are developing new ways to do that, of course, but that's what we've got today. But that stimulated the change. So that question actually was important enough to put and important enough to reply to. And what happened was then we moved to another place collectively. So the new legislation was brought out in the Cosmetics Directive, and also the focus on non-animal-based risk assessment methods came up. So those, I don't shy from those situations. They are extremely important. The credibility bit, hey, I stand on my data. You know, and if you want to attack me personally, fine, fair enough, I'm bigger than that, I can take it. But don't come and just be bloody-minded with me. But often those conversations lead to a new place where we should need to be. So I really embrace those situations where my scientific credibility is put on the line against a question.
Thank you. Can I just offer a moderator's comment on that? I hope I heard you correctly, Ian. You said you didn't mind being challenged personally. I think personally in terms of whether you've got the right answer is okay, but one of the things that worries me and why I've put the question about keeping people safe on the table is that a lot of public dialogue nowadays is simply abusive. And it is very, very hard to expect people who are working on the basis of good faith science to put up with that abuse.
Experience from going to a conference in Finland once with animal rights activists shouting and screaming outside, and I walked the line through the conference, into the conference, and I asked them, why are they shouting and screaming? And I said, well, you know, it's a toxicology conference, you're killing animals. Have you read the sign? It says in vitro toxicology, replacement of animals in experimentation. So I invited them in. So, you know, personally I can take that, but I need the dialogue. Somebody said dialogue. That leads to a dialogue. And when the talking stops, the shooting starts.
Good point. I'm already trying to harvest things that one might take away, because I hope you're going to go home from this event having heard one or two things that will make you do things differently, or possibly do things better. And I'm interested in the word dialogue, because how we sustain a useful dialogue is not just something you wish for. You have to put quite a lot of experience and skill on the table. Do you not, Ian? He's not listening to me. You have to put experience and skill on the table. Yeah, yes. Or maybe you can't hear me. There is a problem with the acoustic. I have to say, sitting there, it is very difficult to hear what's going on. So if there are silences, it's because they haven't heard, not because they're being inattentive. My job to try and bridge that gap. Okay, right. Could anybody want to jump in with a question on the basis of having started this session for you? Anybody sitting there? Yes. Tell us who you are, please.
Hi, is it on? Okay. Hi, this is Ritu Nalabola. I'm with the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. This has been a very interesting conversation and discussion so far, so thank you to all the panelists and the speakers from this morning. One point I wanted to sort of pick up the thread on is the word that you used, dialogue, and I think of it more in terms of public engagement. A lot of C's were mentioned, collaboration, communication, and as a regulatory agency, I know that we do very well in terms of communicating and collaborating amongst our peers. We have a lot of international as well as domestic collaboration amongst regulators. But I see that with some of these newer emerging technologies, it's not simply about communicating with the public in terms of our role, which is to ensure the safety of products. It seems like some of these newer technologies with their potentially transformative nature can raise questions that need broader public dialogue. And so I'm not sure whose role it is to engage with the public. Whose role is it to bring and facilitate and convene some of these broader questions that are associated with some of these technologies? So just an observation. Thank you.
Thank you. A very good observation, which echoes something that our panelists have some of our panelists have touched on today. I suppose I could summarize it as that's above my pay grade. It's not my job to step outside my structures. Anybody on the panel like to pick up on that? How do you grow it?
Well, I think in answer to your question, I think it's everybody's job. Now, because of the type of world that we live in and work in, because of, as we said, the positive, but also, unfortunately, the negative use of communicative and social media tools, I think it's everybody's job to communicate and interact. And I think that they have the instruments, the public have the instruments. They probably don't have always the knowledge, they probably don't always have the information or the context, but I believe that we're in a better place now to actually do it. And Yes, it requires more work. It requires another stakeholder with whom you have to interact. But I think it's essential. And I think that in answer, the regulatory agencies who already do, let's take EFSA as an example, excellent communication. This should be part of the discussion and the stakeholder grouping on the table, the public. And there are ways, obviously, polling and, lots of different wonderful technologies we heard. But there's absolutely no question that it will give more credibility, I think, and understanding and information and knowledge and probably trust from the thing. Positives and negatives, but you can't do without it, is my opinion.
Very clear view there from Hilary. Anybody else on the panel want to comment? Kieran.
Yeah, I think if you don't engage, somebody else will. And then you will be reconfigured and you will become irrelevant.
When I was running part of the British Patent Office, I kept on running into instructions not to communicate. And I eventually said to my line manager that he needed to, it was a he, of course, he needed to understand that if I didn't tell people what was going on and it was work on whether they had a future or not, they would simply invent something worse. It is important, I think, to recall that nature abhors a vacuum. And if you don't want something worse, step forward and engage. And if you need support in learning how to engage, make sure you get it. Reskilling all the time is part of the game. Anybody else? Yes.
It's maybe a bit left field, but in terms of research planning, I think, for example, EFSA and other organizations are very good at consulting their science communities about what the priorities are and what needs to be done. I do wonder whether they need to think more about the world out there and what they think is important in terms of helping them to frame the questions. I mean, I'm reminded of something I experienced a little while ago now, and it was more in the context of medical research, and a researcher was talking about there'd been a call, they'd brought this really good proposal together. Science peer review said this is a fantastic piece of work. As an afterthought, they thought, there's a patient group that might have an interest here. Let's go and ask them what they think about this. And it completely changed the approach that they took. And what they did in the end was a piece of research that worked for the target group it was aimed at. If they'd done the research that they planned, it would have been brilliant, and they'd probably got lots of papers out of it. Wouldn't have made an iota of inference. And he said he was really skeptical at the beginning, and it just completely changed his mind about the approach. And I think there are maybe elements in thinking about priorities where that sort of approach is something that could be useful. It's difficult, but it could be very useful.
It is particularly in the context of medicines, actually. But yes, Ian.
You're the public, right? I'm going to ask you a question. Think about the future. Are you prepared to eat food that has been essentially risk assessed wholly by a robot? Put your hands up if you are.
Did you hear that? Only by robots?
Being very direct, the question was asked new technology. 1, 2, 3, 4.
One hand has gone up and then gone down.
Okay.
Sorry.
These are artificial intelligence. So you start them off, give them the boundaries, then they grow their own intellect.
So, yes, so developed AI. Right. Who would be prepared to eat food that had been assessed solely by AI? I don't think that's called a significant majority. You've got your answer. What are you going to do with it?
Well, I'm having a dialogue with the public, you see, and I'm trying to find out why the other people aren't interested in it, so I'd go direct to them and ask why not. And then there will be a long discussion and dialogue about that. And then I'd come back in 2 years' time when we'd actually done something tactile and proved that something happened, and it was good. Ask the question again. Ask it to another bunch of the public. This is an informed public, and they're still cautious, which they should be.
Thank you very much, Ian. Anybody want to comment on that? Should we shift to a question on AI? We have a couple coming up from the floor on the app. Should we do that? Can we have the AI questions, please? Where did they go? I didn't invent them. Right, well in that case we better deal with one of the ones that is on the screen in that case. Anybody want to pick one to answer? Just pick one.
I'll answer the dilemmas question. There can be a conflict between having a very complex word that needs a lot of expertise, at least a lot of different expertises, and the idea that everyone is a learner. That's possible, but I think it's equally plausible to say that there's no conflict, that the very idea that it's a complex world means that you have to be modest and you have to accept that you're all learners, as difficult as that might be after 25 years of calling yourself an expert.
Anybody else on the panel want to comment on that recognition that learning goes on? It is the antithesis of being expert in one sense. No? How do you feel? How do you bolster your expertise? How do you sustain your expertise when actually you have to grow and change? Back to finding ways of keeping skills fresh, I think. And so I thought I was getting a further comment from Kieran. He often throws things from an unexpected direction. I've worked with him for a long time. Okay, we did find the AI question. Thank you, Lucia. How far is today's expert able to use AI?
I'll start us off on that one. I'm slightly unsatisfactory answer possibly, but it does depend on the AI and the context. So within Cochrane, I'll talk within my own context at the moment, we set a very high bar in terms of producing robust health evidence. And it has taken quite a long time to get kind of community acceptance of some aspects of AI that we will be now incorporating into our review production systems. But we are taking a cautious approach, and that's because we want to make sure that we're not compromising on the already very high standard of evidence within those reviews. There are other ways in which we could use the existing AI in scenarios where perhaps it doesn't matter quite so much. So one example is we are now trying to train a machine to extract the sort of pico characteristics of a study so that we can identify that study when we need it. It probably isn't essential that the machine extracts that information perfectly. We can allow some boundaries, some room for error. We don't need the granularity of information that we might need if we were actually going to extract the data from that study. We just need to know, for example, that it was a pharmacological study rather than a non-pharmacological study. So there are it depends on how you want to use it. And I'm sorry if that's a bit of a wishy-washy answer.
Not wishy-washy at all. Thank you very much indeed. Anybody else on the panel got a thought on using AI and plugging it in? Not.
Just one more. The experience of clinical management of disease, it took quite some significant convincing to let hard-nosed pathologists pit their wits against Watson, for instance, and be outdone by Watson on many occasions. And it takes hard-nosed convincing for doctors and nurses who are caring for patients with serious or orphan diseases or serious diseases to give the diagnosis over to an instrument that's taught itself from the literature. And so the door has been opened and the fields have been banged down. The wheat has been banged down to some extent by clinical medicine. We have things to learn from them, how they did that. And therefore, but I'm not suggesting that it is a takeover bid. In the first era of 20 years, it will be a matter of bringing the bits and pieces in that can be useful to help us, like in your case. But as we build the knowledge bases and as it learns how to combine other computational data from modeling at a higher order, a hierarchy order, then it will make things easier for us to make calls and decisions. So I'm not suggesting we let it loose on its own yet.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Nobody else want to chip in on that? Can I do a follow-up then? Again, thinking about what one might go away and ponder as a result of today's discussions. And it came from brief words exchanged during the tea break. What we've been looking at is actually adding to the complexity of what we know. I think I've summarized that reasonably enough. And Cochrane has been, sorry, not Cochrane itself, but you all have been talking about what Cochrane does to handle some of that. Am I right, because I'm old and miss new things, am I right in suggesting that one of the attractions of AI is that it helps us to process what we learn? That it's a useful adjunct to what happens when you open the doors and windows. I'm looking at your body language. Yes and no? Yeah. Was that a yes or a no? Well, either of you, but the microphone's in front of you.
My point is, it can be considered as a tool to do exactly what you said. But it's a tool that actually never forgets. It learns by mistakes. It learns by its victories and triumphs. It moves you set boundaries and rules. It's a machine, but it's able to produce its own logic and use that logic to expand the domains it works in. But you can stop it. You can say, hey, focus on this or focus on that. But
or pull the plug out.
Well, you can pull the plug out, but sometimes, if anybody's ever read Arthur C. Clarke's The Machine, a Dial M for Frankenstein, you can't do that, right? But I think that we should consider it today as a very useful tool that we must learn about how to implement at the surfaces in risk assessment. And we should do that now, because otherwise the train has left the station. And then once it grows, in 20 years' time, we might look back at this conversation and say, hey, look at what happened.
Or how sweet that they were worried about it.
And then we've all retired to Costa Brava because we're not useful anymore, right? So the machines are doing it all.
Yes.
Could I add one point? I think when we start talking about combining AI approaches with public participation, there's one thing we need to also pay a lot of attention to, which is the changes in social behavior which may not be taken into account in our AI systems. I mean, that's one of the lessons that comes out of the failures of Google flu trends. And that's one of the things we worry about a lot with our models, is that we need to keep focusing on how people are interacting with the app as we build up the models. And we need to stay on guard that interaction may change in ways that we're not expecting.
Yes, again, thinking about learning points. I don't think anybody, in fact, somebody used the term magic bullet. I don't think anybody is talking about any magic bullets here, but learning how to cope with things that are new, that may or may not deliver. Kieran, what crossed my little mind just now, listening to the latest intervention, was our experience at the EPO of machine translation, which gets better the more you do it.
Yeah, I mean, I have a positive experience with artificial machine translation, machine learning, and some negative experiences. So the positive experience is that overall the accuracy of doing boring work by AI is better. So if human beings have to do boring, repetitive work, by and large, AI is better at doing repetitive work. The negative experience is twofold. The first experience is that AI will make mistakes which are different from human mistakes. And because the mistakes are different, even though overall it's more accurate, people hate those mistakes. And at least inside the EPO, there was a violent reaction against the mistakes because a human would never make that mistake, even though the machine translation or the machine classification, which was another area where we used this technology, was actually superior, was actually better, less errors, but the errors were different. One last point about AI, which is in a completely different area. Someone used AI recently to assess whether somebody should be recruited to a job or not. And they got great results. The only problem was there wasn't any black people and there was no women being recruited. And the reason was that the data that was fed into the AI machine had a human bias put into it from the last 20, 30 years of recruitment. So be careful what you wish for. You might actually get it.
Thank you for that salutary warning, Kieran. Again, help the moderator. Can I just ask you all, how many of you in this room are actively thinking about how to use AI in your work? It's even fewer than are prepared to eat meat that's been declared safe on the basis of AI. That's interesting. How many of you are thinking that perhaps you ought to be thinking about AI? It's not much better. How many of you still use pen and paper? Like me. Interesting little reflection that we're on the beginning of a curve, I suspect. Right, thank you very much indeed. Can I try something else then? How many of you think that AI is someone else's problem and you'll wait till they've sorted it out? Are you too scared to say, yeah, thank you very much? One honest man. Two. Does it occur to you that there's actually a gap between those two sets of responses? Worth thinking about, I think. Okay, how is the app doing with questions, please? You've got a real question. Up you come. Tell us who you are, please.
It's more something that I want to share.
Oh, good.
I think that AI is not something that we can skip because with the huge amount of data that we have, a human brain is not able to use this data. So to extract value from this data, to use this data, we need an artificial intelligence. From my point of view, the risk now is the ethical problem, because maybe also in food safety, we can consume food that is safe for us, but there could be an ethical problem that an artificial intelligence could not consider. For instance, the people who produce this food, if the condition, how they work. So these are the challenge for me, for the future and for the AI, I think. I don't know if it was clear.
Anybody want to comment on that? It's really an interface, interrelationship point.
Well, everybody thinks that, AI is not the new Jesus in the block. It really is just simply a very large mainframe that's linked to the cloud to other What it actually does is what you tell it to do initially. So extracting data, it's very efficient at doing that, and we've heard examples of that. But what it does with the data then is up to you to try and describe. And therefore, I think the traditional risk assessment people interacting with the mathematical geniuses and the computational scientists who actually portal into the AI mainframes, this is the important bit, okay? And that's where you set the boundaries. And that's where you, in those boundaries, sometimes questions will arise, come back to you from the machine learning. And the machine, if it's clever enough, it will go out and look for literature to support or dement what it's finding, which is an anomaly. So when Watson works, it's got access to everything that is public access, and some of the things that are proprietary as well, because IBM have worked that out. So it asks questions of the literature, comes back, readjusts its position, and tells you about it. But you set the boundaries all the time. That's the important thing. We're not letting it go on its own. The risk assessment tool has to be programmed by somebody initially. Then it learns how to do things, perhaps better.
Anybody else got a comment there? Right, any more questions on the floor, please? No? Right, yes, microphone, and tell us who you are, please.
Hi, my name is Joseph Rasinger. I work at the Institute of Marine Research in Norway. I have one question about, because Watson was being mentioned, how do you make sure that this artificial intelligence and the algorithms stay free and open source? You're saying the Watson, how do you, it's like IBM, it's a company behind it. It's using public data to come up with decision-making processes. And is this available to all of us scientists, or is it behind a paywall? So what I'm wondering is, are you creating some sort of, it was mentioned in a different room there, like digital overlords, which people have not access to unless they pay?
I'm the first person to admit that I'm not the expert on artificial intelligence. I'm just being provocative, as usual, my mother would say. You're right. You buy into a share of Watson at IBM, and your domain is kept to you. It's firewalled, it's protected. The data is in a proprietary unit, right? So it is IBM. IBM are just the first ones to do this. There are other solutions out there. They're arriving, and they could be desktop solutions as well. Using cloud connections, you can actually probably portal into an AI solution that is in the cloud and not particularly owned by a large typewriter company like IBM. But that's the situation at the moment. And of course, a lot of pharma companies use it. They have their own domains. A lot of hospitals are using it with sensitive patient data. And so they've taken the moral discussions on that side. So there is a leader here for us to follow and understand what were the discussions that went on to put patient data into a mainframe like that and use AI to discuss therapy, right? So there is a precedent, but it's an important point.
Yes, it is, and I'd be interested if you wanted to follow up. But could I just say that, again, from the public consent point of view, the particular question of access to medical data provided by hospitals in the United Kingdom, part of the National Health Service, has become an issue of public controversy. The public, however defined, the people who have reacted, have been extremely critical about use of their data in the context of effectively a commercial relationship. Now, there are a string of concerns there, some of which can be addressed more easily than others, but I think it illustrates very clearly that building confidence in the public about how data is being used is actually a very important part of developing policy in this area. That active engagement in confidence building, you're looking doubtfully, but in my 40 years of public administration, I think that probably matters. It will be resolved, but you might resolve it slightly faster if you engaged. I get a nod from him. I feel that's a compliment.
Can I add something? Because I think that's also a very important point, particularly when we're dealing with citizen science projects or other projects engaging with the public, because when we're getting public data, people are participating, working to actually make this project. I think it has to be, what comes out of it has to be open. The data has to be open, the algorithms have to be open, and people should be able to look at the algorithms and figure out what we're doing. And that's something where the agencies really play a big role, because if you're partnering with a citizen science project, you can push for that and demand it.
Yes.
Yeah, I completely agree. And also, just to go back to the earlier presentation, the data has to be fair as well. We need to start moving towards much better interoperable systems so that we're not just collecting data so that it can just be used in one silo and nobody else can read it in or understand how it's structured.
Yes, a good aspiration, that, and I can, just standing here, contemplate the difficulties along the way of getting there. Not quite motherhood and apple pie, but there's a big way to go before that becomes the norm, I think. Or am I wrong?
No, there definitely is a long way to go, but I think it should be a part of, big organizations' sort of strategy to really advocate for fair data from now on, rather than just doing things in their own way and thinking that's going to be something really difficult to do. So I see that as a role within Cochrane, for example, to really make sure that the data that we collect from the crowd is not only open, but that it's completely reusable as well.
Hilary.
Well, I mean, I mentioned the FAIR data this morning. Obviously, that's one of our main focuses, and of course, some people talk about it as a nice motto or a word or an acronym, but it's true. It has to be findable, it has to be accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And then there's all the other words around it, reproducible and things like that. So I think it goes back to it, and it's a component of this whole discussion. I think that the data part is important, and it brings us back to the whole trustworthiness, the credibility, and other things. I think there are other components, and it's wonderful that they're working together. I would like to say, well, I have the microphone in my hand. I heard, it's really interesting because I've heard about, I'm trying to count them, I've about 20-something Cs that I heard this afternoon in this context, in this session, which I think is quite fascinating. But communication, clarity, credibility thing. In fact, clarity is the one I didn't hear, and I'd like to say something on that if I could. I think that in all of this, in one of the I think important points is as well that if we all seem to agree that you need to cooperate and you need to communicate, but you need to be clear in your objectives and really focus on it as well. So there's another C to add to the many that there are. I think it's really important in the consensus, and even in engaging with the public or whatever, that the clarity around that and what you really want to do is really, really important too. So there, I think I've changed the subject slightly.
I'll change the subject. I'll try to make a link between what you just said and a question that I read from Carolina Pereira. How does the expertise of the future of scientists at regulatory agencies, how is that different than the expertise in other agencies? And I think that brings up another C, if we're talking about Cs, which is agencies compete with each other. There is competition between agencies. You only have to look at what gets approved in the United States, and what gets approved in Europe, what gets approved in Japan, what gets approved in China. Not always the same. And sometimes it's quite simply because there's institutional competition between the different agencies. And sometimes it's because society has said, we will take risks which for us are acceptable because we will, for example, in the balance between innovation and risk-taking, our society is more innovation biased and less risk biased. And in Europe, there's the precautionary principle, which is quite a dominant one, and a bit of anti-innovation. Whereas in China, I think that's not the case. So there is competition between the agencies. Different agencies will have different expertises. Even when you have the same facts and the same data, you may come to different conclusions because ultimately there is a value set behind all of that. And if there isn't a value set, there might actually be different intentions behind your evaluation and how it actually then plays out in your region of the world. One last thing about AI and data, I don't want to go down a rabbit hole, but cybersecurity, you might want to, I don't know of a single bank across the world that is able to withstand cybersecurity attacks. And I don't think any of your databases are able to do that either. And that will play a big role in acceptance of AI.
Yes.
It's not, it's tick-tock, that one.
How corruptible is it, really? Entirely fair point, Kieran. Thank you very much indeed. Anybody else longing to jump in, feet first or head first, or give the discussion a slightly different direction? Other questions? Well, I can think of some of the answers to the first one, but would the panel like to pick up on the first question from Carolina Pereira? What?
First question first one I was just trying to answer. Maybe it was
Yeah,
a
no,
bad answer.
the first one is what I'd like you to answer, yes. Carry on, yes, first one.
First one, but that was precisely my point, that regulatory agencies compete with each other, and therefore they have different expertises. If you want me to add something to it, I would add the following, which is that the vast majority of regulatory agencies are managed on the basis of transactional performance and not contextual performance. All your balanced scorecards, all your KPIs, all your definitions of success, all your HR systems are based on the transactional environment. Very little is based on the contextual environment. The agencies that will be successful in future are those that have a much stronger look at what's happening in the contextual environment. Those are the ones that will end up being listened to and will end up being credible. If you focus on the transactional environment, which is the narrower world of risk management, I suggest you're going to have a problem. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but certainly the day after tomorrow.
Thank you. Anybody? Matthew?
Could I just quickly say something on that as well? And if I could add yet another C word into the mix, which is capacity. And I think that might have something to do with the differences between scientists who work for regulatory agencies. We live in an era, particularly in the public sector in Europe, in the UK and elsewhere, of austerity and of limited resources. So scientists have to be careful with their careful with those resources. Whereas, in the private sector, large corporations, you have a lot more capacity. And so the science of the future might look different on that basis. How do you fill the capacity gaps? AI, for example, we will talk about AI. For a lot of people, it's a way of filling capacity. a way of building in machine learning, for example, so that it can do tasks a hell of a lot quicker than we can. So if you're thinking about the expertise of the future, specifically in agencies, EU agencies, that capacity issue, doing science and producing credible expert knowledge in an era of limited resources, that I think would be a key issue.
Yes, I know you want to come in, but can I just comment on the question of living without enough resources? I mean, as I say, my career has been entirely public sector, and not having the resources to do what you need has been part of all of that career. It just gets worse with every decade. Running a patent office is not bad because you generate your own money. But I think that it's also true of the private sector. The private sector's life on the other side of the fence is not necessarily that much better, but what will drive the investment is the perception that it is profitable, and is profitable in line with public policy outcomes. Question for your minister. Ian.
Ask a direct question that addresses the question absolutely directly. To the audience, how many of you in the room here work for EFSA? Put your hands up. Okay, it says about 50 people in here. Put your hands down. How many of you in the room have got a background in computational science working for EFSA? 4. Okay, so in my world, because of the data overload, data variation, data storage, data analysis, data integration, if EFSA does not expand its computational pool of people who understand how to shift numbers about and do good things with them, I think that they will be missing a trick. That's my personal view. I would like to ask the question next year and see 15 hands in the room, and some AI experts as well.
Okay. Yes. Right. Well, I'm not sure I'll be back next year to do the. No, it's all right. I have to say, I feel I'm in a Greek tragedy. I'm pursued by the Eumenides. The flies are hurtling around us, but I keep on reminding myself, no, I'm in Palma, it's all right. It's quite, can I follow up Ian's question? How many of those of you working for EFSA feel challenged by what he's just asked? Right. Ian asked how many people work in this room for EFSA, and X hands went up.
So about 50 hands went up, and then I asked the question, how many of those 50 hands have a computational background? In other words, have worked with computational science? And 4 people put their hands up, 4 or 5.
Yeah.
None of one over there. So it's about 10% or less of the people in the room, and this is a select audience. These are people who are interested in next-gen training and expertise, so it's kind of biased anyway. So ask the question of all of EFSA.
Yes. And Mike, would you like to contribute to the dialogue? You just agree? All right, fine. Life is full of selective audiences. It's one of the hazards we have to navigate. But I had an interesting human question for those of you who work for EFSA, which is how many of you are okay with the information that came out of that process? You say, well, that's how it is. How many of you are okay with that? You're okay with that. Okay, 2, 3. Say again? Yes, but the point that seems to be illuminated here, Ian's suggestion, okay, where a selected audience, is that there may be a structural weakness in the skill set in EFSA. And my question then is, how happy are you with that? And the answer is, you're okay.
What I'm saying is that there are additional and different and other expertise within EFSA, so I'm not seeing this necessarily that I'm not sure we are really lacking that. I mean, we have this expertise within the organization. It all depends how we use that expertise, how it is amplified, even if it's only 10% of staff.
Fair enough. I wasn't trying to conduct a skill audit. I was just interested in, because sometimes looking ahead, when you start to talk about what you're going to need next, and we've talked a lot about giving people skills, that's been a consistent theme from the start. A lot of people will say, but I can't do that. And that starts to be demotivating and raises issues of how you run a place. So I was interested as a former senior manager in how it felt. And the answer is not too bad for the moment, I think, is my reading of where you are, which is interesting information. Good. Could we have the questions up again, please? Off you go.
Limitations of crowdsourcing. It seems one of the big limitations that I found is motivating people. And with mosquitoes, I gave you an easy example because they keep being bitten, so they've got a great motivation built in. For other things, it's a lot harder to keep people's attention, to keep people participating. And in fact, one of the other questions that I saw up there earlier was, can AI be used for participant engagement in these types of projects? And I think obviously it can. I mean, that's exactly what Twitter and Facebook do to keep user engagement. But I don't think we should be doing that. I think that getting people addicted to our citizen science apps, even though it may be useful for getting information about important things, is not really the area that we should be moving. So.
Yeah, I would say definitely. We come across that very challenge of getting people interested in some of our tasks. I know it sounds like we've done pretty well with 10,000, and quite frankly, I'm amazed that we've found 10,000 people who want to look at an abstract for a trial. And so just the other side of that then, one of the sort of key challenges is around rewards and reward structures and how you, acknowledge the contribution that's been made. And particularly in a kind of academic setting that's quite rigid around rules about authorship and contributorship, that's an additional complication, an additional layer to try to navigate. Those have definitely been our experiences.
That's very interesting. It doesn't surprise me at all, I have to say, on the basis of my own experience. But I think it's a very useful statement from you, given the interesting work that you're engaged in. And none of this is straightforward. Are you about to utter another thought, Kieran? No, you're not. Okay. there was another question which I think I would like to add to one that I have here. It's the question about what EFSA should be investing in terms of skills. Have I got that right? And what I have on my crib sheet here is what are the skills and capabilities that risk assessors need for their future role. And I think we've had a big push from Ian on that, but not just EFSA, but what direction should you be looking in terms of, I don't know whether I should say riding the wave or shaping the future or being there and getting it right. I mean, you can define it in a number of ways, but for regulators working in the field of risk, what actually do they need in the way of additional skills to do this properly? And it may be just better reward and motivation. I mean, that's come out very clearly from some of the things you've said. And I think you can all comment on that.
Oh, God. First of all, if I understand it correctly, EFSA is not exactly going to get a lot of funding. That, in fact, my understanding is most agencies will have their funding cut when the UK finally decides to cut the umbilical cord that exists. And therefore, one of the most difficult things is you will have this conversation in skill sets around priorities. This is more important than that. This is more important than that. And that's a very dangerous conversation to have. So my advice on the skill set would be to get a good balance that will keep you relevant and keep you credible. Because the risk of the prioritization conversation is that you force yourself to go down a particular direction, computational science or whatever the direction is, and you end up becoming irrelevant and you lack credibility. So when you have tight resources, I would say focus on re-educating your existing staff, start setting them targets concerning reskilling, and start setting those targets in the areas of sense-making, computational science by all means, communication, engagement, but make sure that it's a balance of different skills. Don't make a mistake and say there's a silver bullet, because I can promise you there isn't.
Yeah. Okay, and I've got somebody on the floor who wants to chip in as well.
Just a comment, so I agree fully. I mean, the question is, what is the key competence? And I don't think there is one. So I agree fully with Kieran. There has to be a set of them and a balance across the organisation, in particular EFSA for this, with the many different things that we talked about. So yes, computational is part of it, but definitely would be a mistake to focus on one, or to think that there is one or a top three. So
all we need is people who make a really good cup of tea. Precisely. You were going to come in. Can you tell me who you are, please?
I'm Steph Bontra. I'm actually one of the EFSA employees. I wanted to go back, building also on your last comments now, to the earlier discussion of competence skills that we need and how much we would need to invest on AI. I would like to bring to the discussion that, in fact, EFSA was set up as a networking organization. So we have 500 people working in EFSA. We work with 200 panel experts. We work with 1,500 experts on an annual basis in Europe. So it's probably not the best strategy to try to accumulate all the knowledge in-house in EFSA, because that's actually against our nature. We're a networking organization working with 28 member states still, and a lot of other countries. So therefore, probably we would need to be specialized, all of us, in our different domains, in networking and facilitating access to outside resources. And that goes back to the talk of Alistair. If you think of AI, I think the investment of Europe is something in the next 5 years like 20 billion euros, don't quote me on this exact amount, but it's a bit of the Commission and a lot of the bigger member states who will invest on this. So probably the trick for us to play is to build on that and to make sure that we integrate this into our workings rather than developing everything ourselves.
Thank you for that. I have a lot of intellectual sympathy with that final thought, that actually you don't have to do everything yourself. It doesn't matter where you are. And collaborative is always, it may take a bit longer, but it is much, much better and more effective. I have to do, it's not quite a commercial break, but my timetable indicates that at this stage, I ask you please to revisit the cloud question and put down the word that you want to say now reflects your thought about expertise of the future. And at the end of the session, we'll put up before and after, and we'll see whether you have moved or not. So please prepare to vote, say what you think on that expertise of the future. And I look forward to seeing whether there's been substantive movement or whether you are happily consistent. We shall see. Thank you very much indeed. I'm 2 minutes late with that. This is not good. I have until 25 past when I hand over to Salome. And I have been trying in the course of this afternoon to pull out take-homes, things to think about. I can't give you a suggestion for a life-changing sentence that you can go away with, and as a result of which all your problems of the future will be managed. But I think, particularly with the broad range of excellent contributions we've had from the panel, that we are starting to see one or two ideas coming out. Now, you've got a hand on a microphone. Can I hear from you? Yeah? It'll come on in a moment, yes.
Thank you. It's working?
Yes.
Okay. I just want to come back to, well, in terms of expertise in the future. Of course, it's quite important that we, certainly based on also the innovation which is, let's say, ongoing currently in methodologies. I think it's important that we have to look into the kind of expertise that we are, let's say, looking for. But what is very important is also that we need to set priorities on the basis of we all have, let's say, limited resources. And we also have, let's say, an organization in EFSA, for instance, which is having particular facilities. And what is very important and what I'm always, let's say, explaining to the outside world is we don't have laboratories. So we are, let's say, relying on other institutions which are, let's say, dealing with generating data, which are dealing with, let's say, the methodology validation, which is very important for us. But I think that the mapping, what we're now doing together with all the agencies, not only in the European Union, but also internationally, is quite crucial to see how are we going to do that in the future? Where do we put the priorities? What are, let's say, activities that we are going to ask DG Research or other research organizations to take on board? And that could be short-term, could be long-term, but I think that priority setting is crucial now. And that is also what I feel if we are working together with other agencies, not only in Europe, but also worldwide.
Thank you very much indeed. Can I start this process of coming into land now? It's been immensely interesting for me, certain echoes of my past life. And as a citizen and a taxpayer, quite a lot for me to think about. I note, I think, it's very interesting that people who are here are looking ahead. That is a good place to be, not just looking inwards. And that sense of engagement with a changing world is very important because the shortest route to extinction is not engaging with the changing world. Quite what is going to matter most in our future, we have no way of telling. And a word that has come out both from the panel and in conversations has been flexibility. That's really easy to say, though I will say as a senior citizen that the older you get, the less flexible you become. It's just a factor of aging. But even for the younger people, being flexible is easy to say, but actually it carries with it a long tail that is a tale of anxiety. Can I cope? Am I going to be equipped? Will I be valued if I take this exciting step? There's a lot of, if you like, reassurance that an organization that is looking ahead and thinking about future expertise can offer to the people who work here. Because if you're not careful, you're sending a message saying, well, we would have loved having you 5 years ago, but actually you're out of date and that's not how we do things anymore. That's a subliminal message that will come in very quickly. So thinking about your positive messages for what comes next, positive contribution to the skills, engagement with people, not just telling them, but hearing from them, is very important. I was telling a little story at tea. I trained civil servants in the 80s, and one of the things I had to do, senior civil servants, the top ones, one of the things I had to get them to think about, never mind do, was how they talked to people. Because these were all men of a certain age, British. When they sat down to talk to you, they put their feet out in front of them and they talked to their feet. This was not actually very effective. We had to reskill them. Some of them made it, some of them never learned, but we survived, I think. So that how you talk about what you need next is actually modeling some of the behaviors we've been talking about as well, letting in comments and contributions from people who before weren't let in or weren't part of the expert cadre or the expert circle. So that in a sense, the organization can, in relation to the people who work here, or in any organization, model the behaviors that they're hoping to get from the people who work for the organization. We do this internally and we do it externally. It's entirely consistent. So that this is not a look in the mirror and see yourself as inadequate. It's a look in the mirror and say, yeah, I can do a lot of this. I'm doing some of it already. We just need to do more. But I think that process needs to be more interactive and more collaborative than it has traditionally been. We've used the dialogue word, come up a lot. Listening skills are actually not something that we all have. They can be taught. How you hear people is the subject of a lot of work. Reframing comes into it. I do dispute resolution and conflict resolution in my spare time, and reframing what you've heard so that you can move on is a key skill in that. How do you hear? How do you listen? Is this a listening place, or is it not? Don't forget the keeping people safe. I talked about how abusive life is nowadays. It staggers me, the vitriol that gets thrown around. If you're encouraging people to engage, they have to know that you're going to keep them safe. It's a necessary part, in my view. Other people may disagree. I may be pushed around when we leave this room, but I think it's part of the contract that you have to do this. You have to go forward. You have to engage. You have to be challenged, but we have your back. And that includes keeping you safe in the electronic dimension as well as in the physical dimension. Talked a little bit about doing things differently. We all know we have to. I'm a great advocate of just doing it. Go for something that you know you can deliver quite easily. Go for something that's going to bring you a success quite soon. Makes you feel good, and it shows that the direction of travel is worthwhile. You can argue forever about why not to do something. In a sense, it's in the DNA of the public sector. Why not? Turn that round and say why we must. Just one or two small ones. But again, that's coming through. What I've heard from you and from our speakers is lots of ways that the next is either within reach or already happening. Take comfort from that. And for God's sake, be prepared to make a mistake. I mean, we do all the time. And for some reason, those of us who are regulators stand in the naughty corner for getting things wrong more than the rest of the human race. Well, I'm sorry, we're all human and things go wrong. Dust yourself down and move on. And the way science is evolving means that it is absolutely inevitable that some of the calls you make will be overturned in 5 months or 5 years or 15 years or 50 years. But they will be overturned. We will have learned more and you will be shown to have been wrong. Do the best you can. Phrase I used when I was a hearing officer, taking the best view I can of the matter. I can't do any more than that, nor can you. And grow citizens' trust by being honest about that. I'm 1 minute short of finish time. Can we put up the vote on how the words have changed, please? That's the original one, yes? That's where you started. And the bigger the letter, the more of you used it. Well, I think they all get ticks. I'm interested in how small some of them are, but never mind. Shall we go on to the next one? Ready for the next one? Right, I think we need another half day to work out why. But you got the C's. It's a good thing I'm not working, otherwise I would say I want to come back and work with you on building resilience, but that's another matter. Salome, I think I have done what I was asked to do. I've done it on time, 25 past. It's been great to work with you as a panel. Thank you all very much indeed. It's been terrific. And I hand over to Salome to bring us into land.
Thank you very much indeed for these insightful exchanges, and thank you very much, Alison, for moderating this discussion, which clearly provides us with some food for thought. I might actually need more than 5 minutes to be able to summarize this very rich discussion, so please forgive me, Alison. It was indeed quite rich. So we will, of course, get the full set of concluding remarks in the proceedings of that conference, but I will try, nevertheless, to put forward a few words. So what we learned, basically, and I think it was a confirmation of what we already discussed earlier in the afternoon, was that the future will be turbulent and uncertain. The organizations, the agencies, the public service in general, apart from the very complex already nature and the intertwined character of the question, the scientific questions it has to face, will also face a certain number of challenges over the next decade. We discussed financial pressure and cuts, increased expectations, increased societal expectations, which clearly put a different emphasis on a certain number of capabilities that organizations now have to demonstrate. It's about cooperation, collaboration, coordination, communication, convening power. We used a lot of C words. It was also about sharing of expertise. Not only for organization would we need a bit of readaptation, but also for people. The people that we will have to recruit will need to be recruited against a whole new set of competencies, of capacities. We mentioned, of course, some very technical capabilities like data science, computational science, but also some soft skills. Here again, with a lot of C's, collaboration, combinational power, courage even, but also creativity, curiosity, and as well what-if thinking. adaptive intelligence, listening skills, complex problem solving, diversity intelligence and networking, entrepreneurship, and of course, tech savvy. This will be of tremendous importance in the future. We discussed also the importance of communities and the importance for the regulatory agency of the future to actually engage in a very active manner with its stakeholders in the development of its outcomes. We discussed the powerful impact of citizen science, what it could bring to regulatory agencies, and clearly crowds will be more and more used for technical inputs, for creativity, for innovation, for validation, and eventually even for funding. And this, of course, might generate other types of concerns. And we touched a little bit on the privacy issues, on the personal, on the need for maybe increased personal data protection. So meeting the challenge of independence, objectivity, credibility, legitimacy, while securing at the same time scientific excellence and scientific impact will be for me a key challenge for the future, especially if we really have to open broadly to the external world. To support this increased collaboration, we discussed at length the virtue of artificial intelligence. And clearly there was a kind of tension, you know, between a kind of technological, if I may say, point of view which was advocating for the economic and even societal benefits of robotics and AI, and maybe a more humanist point of view, which is really about making sure that we manage to integrate those technologies into the world of work, but without devaluating the role of people. And this was, I believe, extremely important. And clearly, maybe by combining further or more intelligently, humans and machine could lead to better decision-making and to significant improvements overall. So clearly, there are still some impacts on values, on ethical elements that we still need to explore. And inherent value judgment are embedded in all our processes, and we need to have this in mind when making sound decisions. Nevertheless, artificial intelligence could also be used and could also be seen as a way to potentially mitigate and compensate some of the bias which are inherently part also of the scientific decision-making processes. Everything which is linked to confirmation biases, framing biases, loss aversion biases. So pros and cons which needs to be further investigated. And then I would like to conclude maybe by saying that the future organization clearly need to be focused on the context, on the external world. It will probably be, I guess we can imagine, a rather light structure for our future agencies with maybe a small core of on-payroll employees, but surrounded by multiple layers of physical and virtual communities, where ideas, outcomes, innovations will be sourced through the crowd, where a lot, if not everything, will be datafied and managed through algorithms, through dashboards, and collaboration happening through social technologies, but in a culture of autonomy and a permanent experimentation. So, would that be fully the agency of the future? Well, obviously the future will tell. And, but we are certainly at the brink of a transformative change about how we can think of work and how we can think of organizations and expertise. The disruptions we have discussed require a completely new approach to HR and to the very concept of expertise. And we see already that extrapolating basically barely from the past will no longer be sufficient, and we clearly lead to obsolescence. And I think this beautiful word that we saw also at the end, resilience, probably is also capturing a little bit what we feel now vis-à-vis all those changes ahead of us. Voilà. So we are arriving now at the end of this session, and I would like to thank you all very much, panelists, moderator, participants online and on-site, for what has been a really wonderful moment. The key takeaways of today will feed the closing session of tomorrow, which is about remaining relevant in a changing world. And with that, I would like now to give you my heartfelt thanks for your participation and invite you to the poster session, which is happening at the moment in the foyer and will last until 6:30. So thank you very much once again, and the session is open.